North Carolina's Beacon Island and the hundreds of brown pelicans that nest here are in danger. Not from human development or hungry predators, but from something with an insatiable appetite. Erosion.
This whole area used to be the prime oyster area in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Gentle yet constant waves from the Pamlico Sound threaten to engulf the entire island. Climate change and sea level rise are poised to exacerbate the situation. That's why fishermen and conservationists are trying to stem the tide, one bag of oysters at a time.
We're using oyster shell bags to protect the island from erosion, while at the same time we're creating valuable oyster habitat.
Yeah, those are nice. Yeah, so all of those are brand new oysters.
1 spat, 1 barnacle,
5 spat, 3 slipper shells.
All right, man, I've got 2 spat. Okay.
Oyster reefs are part of nature's erosion defense line. Generations of oysters grow on top of each other to form a reef. That reef acts as a seawall, breaking up wave energy and preventing water from eroding the shoreline. But the eastern oysters and the reefs they call home are disappearing.
Oysters are pretty decimated right now, mostly because of how delicious they are.
Real good and tasty, good and salty too.
So they've been really overfished, and some estimates are 85% decline worldwide.
That's bad news for the brown pelicans on Beacon Island. It's also bad news for the 300 other organisms, including the oysters themselves, that rely on healthy reefs for food and protection.
All right, so I'm gonna go to this screen, the next screen, and then I'll zoom around.
Dr. Tony Rodriguez and his team at UNC-Chapel Hill are working to find a way to help restore these reefs. And one of the first steps is understanding what conditions are necessary for oysters to take root.
These oyster larvae are just in the water column, and when they find that right substrate, they attach to it, they form baby oysters or spat, and then they just grow like gangbusters. I think that's amazing. So you just throw out shell and then all of a sudden you have an oyster reef.
But rebuilding the reef is not as simple as just throwing old oyster shells into the sea and hoping for the best.
Where you are in the intertidal realm is really important. So how often that shell is exposed to air during a tidal cycle has everything to do whether it turns into a vibrant reef or is just a pile of useless shell.
A reef's fate is at the mercy of the tide. If the reef is too deep, the oysters can't compete with bioeroders like boring sponges. Too shallow, and oysters risk overexposure and lack of food when the tide is out.
And the laser shoots up from the bottom and then the mirror scatters it.
Dr. Rodriguez and his team are using GPS laser scanners to survey oyster reefs throughout North Carolina. Their research will measure precisely how much the reefs have grown over time.
This is going to be exposed, don't you think?
Up until now, scientists had a general but not exact idea about why certain reefs thrive while others failed.
And that's where the laser scanner and all this surveying gear comes in. So we can measure that to some known point, some datum. And so we can go anywhere in North Carolina, we can find those elevations and say, okay, this is where you want to dump your cult shell. And if you do that, that reef will be vibrant, it'll grow, and it'll be there for year after year.
Besides their function as shoreline stabilizers and a safe haven for marine life, oysters also provide an often overlooked yet critical service for the entire coastal system.
Oysters make their living by sitting in areas where there are things suspended in the water that they can eat.
Dr. Mike Peeler of the UNC Coastal Studies Institute says one of their most important jobs is filtering water.
They actively draw those things out of the water, whether they be particles or algae, and then digest them, and that's how they graze.
It's estimated each oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water a day. But they don't just remove plankton and algae from the water. Oysters play a pivotal role in modifying the nitrogen cycle. By taking particulate nitrogen out of the water column and drawing it down into the sediments, oysters make the water safe not just for plants, but for people.
And the reason it's favorable to people is because excess levels of nitrogen lead to water quality degradation. And we spend a lot of money to maintain water quality. And in oysters doing this for us, this is money that we don't need to spend.
According to Dr. Peeler, ecosystem services that oysters provide are much broader and valuable than many people realize.
Oysters do a lot of things that are positive for the environment. And recently there's been an effort to identify things that natural systems do that are of value to people.
They're better.
One obvious benefit is enjoying oysters as seafood, as well as jobs for the fishermen who harvest them. But regulating wild oyster fisheries and supporting ecosystem services at the same time can be a catch-22.
The problem is that as you fish oysters, you are diminishing the biomass on oyster reefs, and in doing that, you are potentially decreasing the value that oyster reefs have in being a habitat-providing substrate, in removing nutrients, and in stabilizing shorelines. There are economic assessments that have been undertaken that have shown that their value in the system is greater than their value as a fishery. We have less than 20% of our total area of oyster reefs that we once had in the United States. Not only do I think we probably shouldn't fish them to extinction, I think we probably need to restore them. And in doing so, we'll regain both those values of the services to the ecosystem and the dollar value to people.
Get off of there!
As humorist Jonathan Swift once said, it was a brave man who first ate an oyster. And after hundreds of years of harvesting the mighty mollusk, it'll take a smart team to save them.
Got a spot there.
I don't think we can restore it back to where it once was, but we're trying to restore it somewhat, not just for eating oysters, but all the other services they provide. That's really where our research comes in. So how do we bring them back?